Hello, everybody. We are back with another episode of Goddess Bible Study. We're here. My name's Ed Dodge. We got Josh from the house, Lisa Adams, and Nathan Wilson, the bishop, our Gnostic bishop here. So we got the whole crew here. So thank you guys very much for joining us. If you want to see the write-ups, you can go to lostgoddess.io is my Substack. That's my website, Substack. The DNS might not be working just this minute, but edwarddodge.substack.com. It's supposed to go to lostgoddess.io. At any rate, this week we are in the Book of Kings, and we are getting into really the heart of the story now. Historically, we're in the First Temple period, and we're talking about the 9th century BC and three queen mothers that get deposed for their worship of Asherah. And I think it's definitely like symbolic and not a coincidence that there's three queen mothers. The most famous one is Jezebel, but there's also her daughter, Athaliah, and then another one, Maacah, who's older. But we'll get into it. We're also going to talk about the famous Battle of the Prophets on Mount Carmel, which is with Elijah, prophet of Yahweh, fighting against Jezebel. So at any rate, any comments from the peanut gallery before we get into it? All right. So this week on Goddess Bible Study, we're in the 9th century BC, investigating the three queen mothers from Israel and Judah who were deposed in the Book of Kings for the worship of the Mother Goddess Asherah. This will be the first of two parts. It'll take us two sessions to get through these ladies, but this is a historical time period, as we'll talk about. So Queen Jezebel is the most famous of the three and the most reviled woman in the Bible. She was assassinated by the followers of Yahweh, as was her daughter Athaliah, the only woman to ever rule in Jerusalem as a solo queen. She gets murdered. And the first to be thrown out was Queen Maacah, who was the wife of Rehoboam, who we talked about last week. That was the bad king, who was the son of King Solomon. His wife is Rehoboam, or his wife is Maacah. So we also dive into the famous Battle of the Prophets on Mount Carmel, where I argue that Elijah used some stage magic to make his offering erupt in flames and defeat the prophets of Baal and Asherah. It's a very famous story in the Bible, and I think that it could have happened, and I think that there's like a trick behind it. And now we're entering the territory where the scriptural history begins to align with the hard archaeological evidence as literacy emerges in the 9th century BCE with new alphabetic scripts copied from the Phoenicians. So King Asa and Queen Maacah. So King Asa was the grandson of the bad King Rehoboam, and he ruled Judah. So remember, there's two separate nations now. Judah and Israel are two separate countries, and they're both real historical countries. So Asa ruled Judah from 911 to 870 BC. He is depicted in the scripture as the first of the reformist Yahwist kings to actively suppress the worship of Asherah and the other traditional pagan religious practices. There's no specific archaeological evidence of Asa or his reforms. We only have the biblical narrative to go on. But the Bible makes it clear that the Israelites were polytheists fighting a culture war of the role of the old gods versus the new. Among Asa's most striking acts was deposing his own grandmother, Queen Mother Maacah, because she had constructed an Asherah pole. He also expelled the male Kadesh, the transgender priests that the Bible translates as temple sodomites. He throws them out from the land as well. Notably, he did not expel the female Kadesha, who appear to have been far more entrenched and difficult opponent for the Yahwist reformers. So here's the quote from the Bible. This is 1 Kings 15, 11 to 14. Asa did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, as his father David had done. He expelled the male Kadesh from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive image for the worship of Asherah. Asa cut it down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to Yahweh all his life. So as you can see from the text, he did not remove the high places. It's still a pagan culture. They're still doing mostly pagan stuff, but they're starting to make a move. The Yahwists are starting to make a move on Asherah and on at least on the trans male priests. Jehoshaphat, one of my favorite names in the Bible, Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, continued his father's Yahwist reforms, though paganism paganism remained widespread throughout the land. He was also an ally of the northern kingdom of Israel and rode into battle alongside King Ahab, the very battle in which Ahab was killed. The Kadesh were still present during Jehoshaphat's reign and were persecuted again, which suggests that the earlier expulsions had only been partially effective. So here's from the Bible, 1 Kings 22. In everything, he followed the ways of his father Asa and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. He rid the land of the rest of the male Kadesh, who remained there even after the reign of his father Asa. So the only time they ever mention the male Kadesh in the Bible is when they're chasing them away. They're only mentioned a handful of times, and only when they're being chased out. We discussed them in the other episode on the trans folks. They're like the Galai priests of the Mother Goddess Cybele in Rome. And so we have a sense of what they're like. Some of them are going to be eunuchs. The Book of Chronicles tells this story somewhat differently. Written later than the Book of Kings, Chronicles clearly adjust the narrative to present the biblical heroes in a more favorable light, removing embarrassing details and amplifying their piety. So this is from Chronicles, and you can do a lot of comparisons between Chronicle and Kings, and all the embarrassing stuff gets whitewashed in Chronicles. With King David, with King Solomon, all the way through. His heart was devoted to the ways of Yahweh. Furthermore, he removed the high places and the Asherah poles from Judah. So this is the first one says he did not remove the high places. And then in the later version, they say he did remove the high places. And it's clear that Chronicles is written like probably centuries later after Kings and tells the same story, but tells it in a much more modified propaganda. Like all the embarrassing stuff about King David is taken out in Chronicles. So 9th century BC, this is where the Bible meets archaeology. The 9th century BC marks a turning point in the history of Israel, both politically and in terms of the historical record. This is the period when scriptural history begins to align with archaeological data, largely because writing in both Hebrew and early Greek returned at this time. Hebrew inscriptions and coins begin to appear regularly, giving historians solid ground to work with. Omri became king of Israel in 884 BC, establishing the new city of Samaria as his capital. I think Samaria is still there as a city in Israel. His lineage is unknown, but his impact was immediate and lasting. He's one of the oldest biblical figures whose existence has been confirmed archaeologically, and the royal house he founded became known as the House of Omri, just as Judah's royal line was called the House of David. After roughly 50 years of civil war, Omri stabilized the political situation in Israel, forming alliances with Judah to the south and the Phoenicians to the north, while resisting the growing pressure of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Omri's son Ahab succeeded him as king of Israel around 873 BC and reigned until his death in 852 BC. Ahab was a serious and formidable military commander whose forces were large enough to be mentioned by neighboring kingdoms. The biblical writers, however, despised both Omri and Ahab for their devotion to the traditional religion. Samaria, under their rule, featured a large Asherah pole and a temple dedicated to Baal. So here's from the Bible where Ahab becomes king of Israel. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the other kings of Israel before him. I should have said the anger of Yahweh, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So it's very clear what they're doing. So he marries Jezebel. She's a Phoenician princess. Sidon is a city that's still there in Lebanon today. They've been talking about it it was been attacked by the Israelis recently. And so Jezebel's father, this guy Ethbaal, is a real historical figure that they have stuff about him from the archaeology. And Jezebel, they have some stuff that appears to be her as well. And then Ahab, they absolutely have evidence of him, as we will see. So that was 1 Kings 16, 29 to 33.
There's a lot of goddess references in there too. Maacah is also a city of Maacah, which was heavy dominate with Asherah worship as well, near the
Okay.
northern border of modern Israel. Samaria as well being mentioned, that was also a dominant hub for Yahweh and Asherah worship. We found the pottery that had Yahweh and his Asherah there. And the Queen Mothers as well, that's also a direct reference to the goddess that were also called Queen Mothers,
Oh,
so that's
absolutely.
really, really cool. And I think you mentioned her name, Aletheia, I forgot it is. It's similar to the
Athalia.
Greek word Aletheia, which means is a goddess of truth, which is also
Okay.
interesting. So everything I've seen there is just goddess, 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 and that's pretty neat.
Yeah, we will get to Athalia in the next episode. Um, so this is the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC in the Kirk Stele. Uh, so in 853, King Ahab led a major military force at the Battle of Karkar, one of the largest and most significant battles of the ancient Near East. The battle pitted the resurgent Neo-Assyrian Empire, led by Emperor Shalmaneser III, against a coalition of 12 kings fighting in resistance. According to the Kirk Stele, the Assyrian Victory Monument, now in the British Museum, King Ahab of Israel sent the largest contingent of chariots among the resistance, although scholars dispute the exact numbers. The Kirk Stele is one of the earliest extra biblical references to an Israelite king. Remarkably, the Bible makes no mention of this battle, the Battle of Karkar, at all, which is a notable omission given how significant the conflict was for the entire region. So this is an image of, and tell me what you guys think. This is an image of the Kirk Stele that hangs in the British Museum, but I had AI recreate it to make it a little more legible because the original image, which you can get off like Wikipedia, is like hard to see. So I had an AI as I just like recreate this image for legibility, and it kind of like, I mean, I can't read the cuneiform to say if the cuneiform's accurate, but I don't know. I don't know if that's acceptable to people. It seems cool.
Looks a little bit like some of the Egyptian art, though, too.
It's totally cuneiform, but yeah,
Mhm.
it's Assyrian. The Kirk Stele of Assyrian Emperor Shalmaneser III celebrated the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. So then we have another one. This is the Mesha Stele. This is the battle with Moab in 840, so 13 years later. The Mesha Stele is a victory monument erected by King Mesha of Moab, which was one of the neighboring countries of Israel, celebrating his successful war against Israel and Judah and the victory of his god Chemosh over Yahweh. It is the oldest known mention of Yahweh outside the Bible, and it also references the house of Omri and possibly the house of David and King Ahab himself. The events described in the stele correspond to the account in 2 Kings 3, verses 1 to 27. So this is a real battle that the Bible talks about, and that the Israelites lose the fight, and then but the Moabites have their victory stele that talks about this Bible story. And this is an important story because this biblical account includes a dramatic and disturbing turning point. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had turned against him, in a moment of desperation, he sacrificed his own firstborn son and heir on the city wall, and the tide suddenly shifted in Moab's favor. According to the Bible, the human sacrifice of a royal prince appeared to work. So this is again another AI recreation of this one's in the Louvre of the Mesha Stele from 840 BC, the first mention of Yahweh, and he's losing the battle to Chemosh, the god of Moab. So when the king of Moab, so this is from the Bible now, 2 Kings 30, 26, 27. When the king of Moab saw the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. And the fury against Israel was great, but they withdrew and returned to their own land. So that is fascinating because that is like a human sacrifice totally working, and Yahweh losing the battle to Chemosh after a human sacrifice of a royal prince was made.
So they are making meaning of this sacrifice. And the meaning that they're making of the sacrifice is that it, quote, worked.
Right. I mean, they won the battle, right?
It wasn't, it was not a coincidence. It worked.
As far as they were concerned, it worked. I mean, as far as the
Yeah.
Bible is concerned, it worked. I mean, the Bible makes, I mean, according to the biblical narrative right there, I mean, the biblical narrative is that after he sacrificed his son, this wind came through and turned the tide of the battle against the Israelites. Because the story is much longer. I didn't quote the whole story. It's like they had done this long attack and fighting into Moab, and they were about to win the whole battle and like sack the city. And in this act of final desperation, the king sacrifices his own royal prince. Some translations have it that he burned them in fire. I didn't have that translation.
Which was common back
So
then for sacrifice. They also, in most cases, they usually slit the throat and then burnt them as well, which is pretty ruthless. Another thing is to mention they also believed that these gods, especially Yahweh, were eating what they sacrificed to them, such as even the animals and humans too. There's a reference to Yahweh calling him eater of livestock and virgins, or devourer of livestock and devourer of virgins, because virgin sacrifices also took place to Yahweh as well. So that's interesting. So he's actually eating that. As one reason why the Gnostics mocked him as a basically cannibal god or a man-eating god. So
where is that quote from?
the man-eating god,
The
that
one you had
might
before
be.
about him devourer of
Oh, that one there, I forgot
goats and
exactly where
virgins.
that one comes from, but the eater of men is a Gnostic one from, I think, the Gospel of Philip, or it could be
Okay,
Gospel Truth. And the other one, I've forgotten exactly where that comes from, but it's Jewish. So
gotcha.
it's some old Jewish literature that mentions him being a devourer of virgins and living on a mountain hoarding golden treasure. So basically, the text describes him. I forgot exactly where it comes from. There's little bits from the Bible as well. So they're inspired by Bible things and they've put it into a whole quotage. And it's basically almost describing Yahweh as a dragon, basically. So it's very interesting.
Huh.
And breathing out smoke and fire, which is also in the Bible as well, being mentioned. The whole thing could be mentioned in the Bible, but I believe it's been taken out and inspired and put into a whole quote from Jewish literature, I believe. So I know I've read it before, I've just forgotten exactly where it comes from.
All right. I mean, I need more descriptions of. I'm actually excited to illustrate these stories in the graphic novel, like the one with the human sacrifice will be a fun one to tell. Um, but I need all the descriptions of Yahweh as a anthropomorphic God, so I can like create my image of him. I've got some ideas for it, but we'll get to that later. So Jezebel, the Phoenician princess and queen of Israel. Ahab's queen was the Phoenician princess Jezebel, who died in 841 BC and remains the most vilified woman in the entire Bible. She was the daughter of Ithbal I, also known as Ethbaal, of Tyre and Sidon, who had been a high priest for Astarte before assassinating the previous king and seizing the throne. Ithbal was an actual historical figure, documented to have lived from approximately 915 to 847 BC. The royal marriage between Jezebel and Ahab served as the seal on a powerful political alliance between Phoenicia and Israel. Together, Ahab and Jezebel built a new temple to Baal in Samaria, complete with 450 prophets, and erected a grand Asherah pole in the capital city. In Jezreel, they built both a palace and a temple to their mother goddess Asherah, home to 400 prophets, with Jezebel as their personal patron. The story is generally told that Jezebel introduced foreign gods into Israel, but this framing is misleading. Baal and Asherah were not foreign gods. They were the incumbent gods, the traditional deities of the land. Yahweh was the new young god, representing a radical break from established religious tradition. When Jezebel supported Baal and Asherah, she was defending the old ways against the dangerous revolutionaries. It was Elijah and the Yahwists who were the insurgents. So Elijah was a prophet of Yahweh in Israel and the chief opponent of Ahab and Jezebel. The Yahweh's prophetic order, called the Sons of the Prophets, operated at his movement. Jezebel, for her part, actively persecuted the Yahwists and worked to eliminate them. Elijah confronted Ahab directly, declaring, "I will bring disaster upon you and wipe out your house." He also prophesied Jezebel's gruesome end. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the walls of Jezreel. 1 Kings 21, which does in fact happen in next episode. So the confrontation reached its peak at the Battle of the Prophets on Mount Carmel, described in 1 Kings 18:22-40. The contest was simple. Each side would call upon their God to ignite a sacrificial bull on the altar without the use of fire. Elijah won, and in the aftermath slaughtered all 450 prophets of Baal. The 400 prophets of Asherah, however, were left entirely untouched. And scholars have pointed this out and debated why does he only kill the prophets of Baal and not kill the prophets of Asherah? We can discuss that. So Elijah chose Mount Carmel strategically. There was an old limestone altar. So this is my personal theory here. I learned it from somebody. I'm not sure where I learned it. I did not invent this idea, but this is pretty funny. I wrote about it in my book. There was an old limestone altar to Yahweh that had been torn down, and limestone that has already been burned changes chemically into quicklime called calcium oxide. And this is part that just goes hand in hand with like making concrete. Turns chemically into quicklime called calcium oxide, and then there's a 3-step setup. So he rebuilt the altar from the old quicklime limestone. He salted the meat and altar with powdered sulfur, which was totally available, and then drenched everything with what appeared to be water, but was actually naphtha, thick water, a clear petroleum distillate known in the ancient world and imported from Persia that would look like water from afar. So the combination of naphtha plus sulfur plus quicklime creates a violent, fiery chemical reaction, essentially the same technology later weaponized as Greek fire in naval battles. A related recipe appears in 2 Maccabees 1:31-36, where nephthar, meaning purification, produces exactly such a fire. Elijah was very clever. He challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest he knew they would lose because he was utilizing a magician's trick. So now we'll read the story. This is my AI recreation of the fiery blaze. But this is a long story here. So this is from the Bible. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. And when he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your family, your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, if Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophet." Normally I change the Lord into Yahweh, but I missed these in this edit. "I am the only one of Yahweh's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bowls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bowl and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you can call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh, the God who answers by fire. He is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and shouted louder, and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar. He repaired the altar of the Lord of Yahweh, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to make the word of Yahweh had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of Yahweh, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large waters with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it the third time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Yahweh, answer me, so these people will know that you, Yahweh, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of Yahweh fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Then all the people saw this. They fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God." Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. 1 Kings 18:16-42. It is notable that all 450 prophets of Baal were killed, while the 400 prophets of Asherah were left entirely untouched. In this period, Yahweh was associated with Asherah and would eventually be associated with Anat as well. This fight was between Baal and Yahweh. The goddesses remained ready to align themselves with whichever male god came out victorious. Jezebel's response was fury. She sent a threatening message to Elijah. "May the gods punish me severely if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." Elijah, afraid for his life, fled into the desert. Jezebel surely prayed to Anat for his slaughter. So from the Bible, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. So that's the end of what I got prepared for this week. Next week, we'll continue the story of Jezebel, Athaliah, and both of their murders at the hands of Jehu the usurper and the followers of Yahweh. So there we go. Any comments from all you guys?
Kind of interesting with the whole ignoring of Asherah and also with the Yahweh being associated with Asherah, because so is Baal as well, which is kind of interesting. And also before all that whole Asherah being both these gods' wives, that was their mum. So
Yeah, I
that
don't
was their
think it's their
mother.
wives either. I think it's their mothers, and that it's the high god with the mother goddess with the Asherah pole next to the altar. I don't think that they're wives, because Yahweh later on gets associated with Anat and some of the other archaeology that we see later on. Um, and we have a lot of archaeology of Yahweh and Asherah. We never see Yahweh associated with Astarte, though, which
They
I think
definitely
we
picked
could
and choose
speculate about.
goddesses. But it's not ironic because they had a large pantheon of gods and directly chose to worship one, which made them stand out compared to many of the other pagans of their time. But it wasn't uncommon. Many pagans had their one particular deity that they favored and chose to directly worship instead. Some chose, for instance, in the Greek world, Zeus or Apollo or Helios, so they had their own favorites. Some even prayed to Alexander the Great and told little shrines of Alexander their problems. So, but the consort thing is wild as well, and also the whole mother thing. I think you're right here. I think at this time period that Asherah is the mother, and that's why she's not touched. So she's a powerful figure here. So, and she was a powerful figure in throughout
Yeah,
history.
getting rid of
She
the
was
mother
right.
goddess is no easy. That's not an easy argument to make. I think in the culture, the mother goddess is super popular. She's the goddess of all the harvest festivals and all the wine and beer and all the fun stuff and all the sex. I mean, all the fun stuff goes to the goddesses. And it's the heart of the popular culture.
Also,
So
child safety too, because children died a lot back then as well. So women often pray to goddesses for that divine protection.
absolutely,
So
and
did
take
men
care of the
as well.
children and the virgins and the young, boys and girls, and all the plants and animals. Um, so, but you could totally see how there would be a fight between the storm god for primacy, and you could have two different storm gods fighting between Baal and Yahweh, fighting to be, and they'll just the mother goddess. I mean, it's like lionesses. You'll have like a pride of lionesses with one male god, with one male lion, and the various male lions will fight amongst themselves, and the one male lion that wins gets to go with the pride of lionesses, but only one.
It's interesting.
He's got to fight off the other males.
It's
And
a
so
good point too,
lionesses get the
because
most
Asherah was
powerful one.
associated with a lion, so was Yahweh and maybe even Baal. I'm not too sure. You might be more familiar
And the
with that.
goddesses are
Baal might
definitely
be.
associated with lions. It's a very important part of their imagery. Asherah has lions, and Astarte and not
Here's
all
the
have
thing
lions.
about lions, okay? The male lions might fight between them for, to be like the dominant male. But the thing is, that's pretty much all the male lions do is to
I know.
sire children. It's the females that do all the hunting. It's the females that rear the children. Like the females are the more fierce ones. They're the ones that are making everything happen, and they're working together in that regard. So
Right.
it
They
is
stay together as a
much,
pride.
yeah, it's much more matriarchal.
It's totally matriarchal. They have the one stud that they keep around for breeding
Look at
purposes
too.
and for like fighting off, somebody else for once in a while. But most of the time, the
Sometimes it's
male
just an
lion
offended
just kind of
result.
laying around. He's like a kept man, right?
With regards to, these ancient pagans who happen to also be Israelites, they, you know, how tough would it be to give up, goddesses and mothers and, you know, like female deities, given that that's what real life looks like, you know? So to renounce all these things that are feminine and associated with feminine energy and motherhood, the fierceness, the fertility, all of that, why would they wanna give that up when
Right.
that's what real life is? Like, real life is not that there are no women. Real life is not that, a woman was born from a man's rib, like, that it doesn't work that way. And so why would anybody want to adopt a new religion that denied the very nature of life?
That's exactly right. That is exactly hitting the nail on the head right there. I think it was a really hard sell. I don't think anybody was happy about it at all. I think it gets imposed with force, with violence, and that it only serves like the one priesthood that comes out on top, but everybody else like loses. And I don't think, yeah, I think that the Jews fought about this stuff for an awful long time. They don't really become monotheists until much later on, the Hasmoneans, like in the 2nd century BC, is when they really become the Jews as we know them for now. But in the 400s, they were still pagan. The 300s, they're still fighting about this stuff. Um, because I think it's a really hard sell. I think getting rid of the mother, getting rid of nature and like the cycle of life and the turning of the seasons and the harvest festivals. Like, why would you want to? How is your culture improved by getting rid of the mother? Like, it's not. And like, that's kind of what drives me on all this. It's just like, society would be so much better. We brought the mother back. Um, like, it'd be so much better. Josh, we haven't heard much from you.
I'll chime in here. Yeah. Did you notice in these passages that it was almost, you have Baal and Yahweh. It's almost as if they're fighting for the more older term Elohim. They're
Right.
wanting that title, which is a plural word. So we're watching this in this text like a fight for what is the true God, but yet a title that seems to be a very not a not a not a word that speaks to a monotheistic God. So there's something going on there, which I don't know. It's an interesting thing to see alongside this Asherah goddess at the same time. So
Right. No, the Elohim is really important, and we'll talk about this a lot later on, or we can talk about it right now. But like Elohim is, as you say, a plural word. It doesn't just mean God; it means all the gods. And so Elohim, as they develop
right,
monotheism, systematically and metaphysically, they eventually, start using this word that means all the gods. And there's an equivalent for the feminine, which is Shakti in the Hindus, which is all the goddesses, or Isis is all the goddesses. And so you have at the same time, and we're going to have a whole big section on this when we get to Alexandria, Egypt, when they're in like the 3rd century BC, they're developing this new religion of Isis, where she is systematically syncretized with all of the goddesses all around the Mediterranean. And she goes from being the Egyptian Isis to being the Roman Empire Isis. And she becomes this much more universal super goddess in the Roman Empire. Like she breaks free of just being in Egypt. And Meanwhile, in the same town, in Alexandria at the same time, the Jews are writing up the Torah and they're systematically coming up with their theology of all the gods. And so I'm going to create this dialogue, and I'm going to want to talk to you guys about this when we get to it, of Elohim and Isis having a conversation. And I'm going to do this as a dialogue where in the divine realm, like in the graphic novels, Isis and Elohim are talking, but then on the ground, we're having a debate between the priests of Isis versus the priests of the Levite priests for the Jews that are busy writing the Torah in the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, because like that's when it finally got finished. The final copy we read is late, I'm convinced, by the modern scholarship. And so I think that they were having literally this theological debate between this concept of monotheism, of all the gods of Elohim, versus these rivals down the road competing with all the goddesses. And that they would be having a debate over getting rid of the goddess. And so we'll be able to play with that dialogue. That's an important story I want to put together. But pointing out that Elohim is here, it's like Yahweh is Elohim. This is an important argument that the biblical writers are making to elevate Yahweh from being just another pagan god to becoming this monotheistic God of the total universe. Like, and that's the arc of the narrative for Yahweh from the beginning of the first temple to really 2nd Isaiah. It's really after the exile that he becomes Elohim, because while Judah still existed and the first temple still existed, he was like bound to that temple. But it's only after the temple is destroyed and they're sent into exile, and then you get to 2nd Isaiah, that's when the scholars say you start to see actual monotheistic claims, like of a universal God who's like more powerful than the other gods, as opposed to just two pagan gods fighting amongst each other.
So I have a theory about that. I have a theory that, here are the Israelites, and they've been through a lot. They were enslaved. They were, walking the desert for however long, they were in exile. They were clearly struggling as a people, and, they were downtrodden and vulnerable. And so because that was the case, they were vulnerable to a more kind of, say, narcissistic type of God coming along and trying to impose himself on them. And, maybe one of the parallels that we can make to that would be akin to, like, say, when after the First World War, Germany was so downtrodden and not feeling good, and they were not thriving and everything. And then along comes, like Hitler and the Nazi revolution. And, it gave them something to lift themselves up. But ultimately, it's this like narcissistic abuse person who is, feeding off of and into the vulnerability of people to manipulate them to follow. And so I think that's kind of like if Yahweh, let's say Yahweh's real, one of the gods, Yahweh's like, oh, I want to be big and bad and I want to be it or whatever, and screw these other gods. I'm going to go after these people because they're downtrodden and they've had a hard time, and they're going to want to follow me because I'm going to make them and I'm going to manipulate them.
It's a great point, and I think about like how much of it is like the priesthoods that are being manipulative of the culture versus like these deities themselves existing as principalities in the cosmos. So like, cause like I believe Jesus exists. Like I think Jesus saves. Like that's like a real thing. Jesus, millions of people around the world will attest that their lives are saved by Jesus Christ, and they would really mean it. That like whatever problems they were having, alcohol, drugs, abuse, what have you, that they found Jesus and they were in prison or whatever. They found Jesus and they got their lives straightened up, and like that's totally real phenomenon. Like totally real, right?
You know what? In that case, though, too, let's say that Jesus, Christ consciousness, Yeshua, whatever, is really more like, and what his teachings really, in my opinion, are about is the metaphor for like, the divinity within all of us, right? We're all the children of the divine.
Sure.
And so when people find Jesus, oh, I found Jesus, then I think it's really that they are finding what they understand to be like divinity within themselves, like something that they can connect to in that way. But it's still somewhat outside of them, right? With the way that it works because of Christianity.
Right.
Just like else regarding Yahweh or even El, they had children, whether some people like it or not, whether you see it as gods or angels, depending on the theology they're looking at. So that being said, Jesus, the only begotten Son, doesn't quite make sense. But if you look at the actual language of the wording, it makes a bit more sense because it means only unique Son. So unique out of all the other Elohim. And something that Joshua mentioned before about the fighting over a title Elohim, I agree. I also think the title El and El Elyon is being fought over, being El for God and El Elyon for Most High God, so the highest God. So I think a lot of that's going on. And during the time period of these arguments, we can clearly see the Torah is still in development, or it's just oral only, because they're still making graven images, as they would like to say that word. They're making Yahweh coins, and they're naming their children after Yahweh. They're not naming them after Moses or any biblical figure yet. That's not there. So that's kind of interesting. So it's showing that texts are being sort of edited during the Maccabean period, which is when they're starting to enforce these laws much more, say, don't eat shellfish, don't eat pork, because during this time, we still see Israelites or Canaanites eating pork, shellfish, and all
Yeah.
this sort of stuff. So it's
Yeah.
interesting, and some even practicing vegetarianism as well. But it's showing that what's going on here. So this Torah is not yet fully developed yet in this system. They're fighting over gods, whose God is best, and they're basically got a different diet to what's being suggested later on. So they have
Right.
all these
Yeah.
laws coming
That-
in. It's like don't
There's
boil cow and milk, and don't eat shellfish, and blah 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 blah. So
right. There's definitely no Torah in this time period. Like definitely not. Like Moses, like the idea that Moses wrote the Torah and that they were carrying it around in the first temple, like there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence inside the story. It
no,
never says inside the story that like Moses wrote the Torah and they carried it around. That is like a later invention. Um, so at this point, like they're just living this stuff. They haven't even recorded it yet. Like the stuff that we see written down is like late first temple. Just by the time we started really seems like they're really truly literate. Like in terms of like writing scrolls, and they talk about writing scrolls, and um, so yeah, they're definitely totally pagan. Like the archaeology is that they're still like have idols in their homes all the way through into like the 400s BC, the 300s BC. Like they weren't following any of those laws of Deuteronomy or Leviticus not at all, not at this time period.
it's really neat to look at that. So it
I want
opens
to
the doors.
Ed, I don't know if you touched upon this, but as I'm kind of looking through the scriptures that we just read, I wonder if there's something else going on here with Baal. I already know from just having raised in a Christian household and reading these stories, I have a certain kind of prejudice against Baal, and there's a
Right.
lot of Baal hate right now, and maybe there should be Baal hate. But I think it's interesting that there could be a lot of propaganda towards this because they
Well,
they
sure.
might have rewritten something. And one of the things that sticks out to me is Baal. One of the definitions of Baal is husband.
Right.
So if you get rid of that, implies there's a wife. And if you're going towards a Yahweh that doesn't have a wife, I mean, are we looking at with the casting down of Baal? Are we getting rid of the couple of the god and the goddess? I mean, is this a retelling of the story? If Baal means husband, obviously there's a wife. If we're kind of washing the story by saying, oh, this is a child eating, child sacrifice, could this story have been rewritten of who Baal was? I don't know. I'm showing some ignorance here. I got to
Well,
reacquaint
the
myself
part
with.
about my Bailey, we will talk about that when we get to the prophet Hosea, which comes up in this is also in this time
Mhm.
period. The prophet Hosea
Right.
talks about he's got the wife Gomer and he's having this divorce or like trying not to divorce. And it's a very important story because Gomer is probably a Kadesha. And so she's having children with other men, and he's calling her an adulterous wife. You know, it's a prophet married to a Kadesha, but she's not, she's doing her traditional thing. Like she's matriarchal, so she can totally get pregnant by whoever. And, but, but, but the prophet Hosea is going to shut her down and shut down her traditions. And he specifically references this. You will no longer call me your Bailey, you'll call me your Ishi. And Ishi is a different word that they had in the vernacular. So instead of
Mhm.
Bailey, which meant my Lord or my husband, like you said, it means my Ishi is the Yahweh version of saying the same thing without using the word Baal in there. Um,
Right.
they're definitely trying to overthrow the family structures and make them patriarchal. I mean, there's no question about that. I think I think that's the biggest things they're fighting about is the patriarchal stuff, which translates to the sex stuff, and then the child sacrifice. I think, and just generally like Bronze Age versus Iron Age, old gods versus new gods, the corruption. I take it so literally that the royalty at the time probably was totally corrupt. And so the prophets of Yahweh are legitimate social justice warriors railing against injustice. I think that's probably true. I have no reason to dispute that. Um,
I mean, wouldn't it just be crazy for them to like turn the tables on everything? Here you have Yahweh who demanded a child sacrifice from Abraham, but then you basically kick Baal out and like say, "Oh, he's all about child sacrifice and that's bad," even though Yahweh did the same thing. What if they're actually playing with this thing in order to get rid of the divine couple that, the husband? Because if you get rid of the husband, you can still have the male god, but if you get rid of the husband, you get rid of the wife.
right.
I don't know. I think
Yeah, no,
I'm gonna
I
have to
think you're
look into
right.
this.
I just think it plays out over like
There's
400 years.
something.
I just think it plays out over a long period of time. But I
Yeah.
think it's all these little bits and pieces that are being plugged in. And they're chipping away, chipping away, chipping away.
It's interesting too, because I just pulled up really quickly on my phone. So like Baal, he was also a fertility god.
Mhm.
So that
Yes.
obviously goes very well with the goddess, and that makes perfect sense, right? And the husband piece, whatever, beautiful. Um, and Lord of the Earth. So there's another like sort of it's fertility,
Mhm.
and also he's obviously esteemed, but interesting that he would be as it says here exactly, locked in combat with Mot, the god of death and sterility. And that makes sense too, right? Because you've got this god of like fertility and life. And of course, there's going to be this sort of like clash with the god of death, which, you could look at the god of death as like Hades, Pluto, whomever, but maybe Yahweh is also very much a god of death, and so therefore against somebody like Baal or Baal, depending how you like to say it.
Ale.
Because if back then, if he was really just about fertility, of course people aren't going to let him go either, or let him go easily.
Some scholars also
He's
believe the
who
fertility role of
blesses them.
Baal was taken directly from Asherah back when they were meant to be a couple as well. So they were forming of that. Because the same argument can be said about Yahweh being associated with fertility, and that would be directly taken from Asherah. So again, that's
Well, yeah,
just
I mean,
a borrowing.
yeah, all these pagan traditions were, I mean, the scholarship always calls them fertility religions. They're all ultimately agricultural and nature-based traditions. That's what makes them in the mother. And moving away from fertility and away from sex, to a monotheistic God who's all by himself who doesn't have sex with a wife, they viewed that as a big improvement and as big intellectual, leap forward that we don't need to have a God having sex with a wife. We don't need any stinking mother goddess to have our monotheistic
The
traditions.
original incels.
The original incels,
There's
right?
always
Exactly.
zealotry of Baal as well, like there was zealotry for
Yeah.
Yahweh. So some believe that Yahweh and Baal were the same God. So that's kind of interesting when you take into that account too. So it's going tit for tat. So sometimes Baal's the nasty one, sometimes Yahweh's the nasty one. We have both these traditions stealing from their father, stealing their father's wife to make it their own direct
I
wife.
think Yahweh and Baal are effectively equivalent. I think they're both warrior storm gods. It's just Yahweh's younger.
I agree with that. Yes,
I don't know how
100%.
you can say that though, in light of the story we just read. Though, how can you say that in light of the story though of Elijah and Jezebel right here? I mean, they
Well,
definitely
because this story is
distinguish
written by
between Baal and
by
Yahweh.
because the book is written by the Yahweh priests. I mean, they're giving their perspective. So they, they're again not written at the same time. The story is written much later after this battle would have gone down. What we're reading in the Book of Kings, it was probably 200 years later, 300 years later than 850 BC. And so they're putting their propaganda on it, and they're trying to elevate Elohim ultimately as their theological project, and they ultimately want Yahweh to kind of disappear because they want it to just be about Elohim, just about the monotheism. The more you talk about Yahweh, the more he takes you back to it being pagan. That's why the Hebrews you weren't allowed to say the name Yahweh. They would write it down, but you weren't allowed to say it because they really just want you saying Elohim and just focusing on that. And let's not talk about Yahweh so much, who sounds like he's pagan. So we just won't talk about it.
Also, other groups that believe that all these gods were just rebelling against El as well. And then that's why we see some groups still worshipping El and rejecting Yahweh, or viewing Yahweh as a lesser aspect of El, like the most primitive understanding we humans can understand of El as Yahweh, or that he's a guardian angel looking after Israel.
Yeah,
That in turn is
El is
security.
Allah for the Muslims. So the ultimate, if you want to be a pure monotheist, you want to go all the way to the source, and that's the Godhead, right? So that's Allah. It's El Elyon.
That's right. It's where the name comes from. It's just they have the Yahweh traits, unfortunately, because it all got mismatched together.
Yahweh. They want to conflate Yahweh with El into one single God that is the Yahweh priests, but they get to be the monotheistic God of the universe.
Yeah. And I like that some Jews viewed that this god was the demiurge, or even that's the Margarites in Pacific. They believed that Yahweh was the demiurge, not a bad demiurge. He was just under the orders of El Elyon, an unknowable god, and was the reason why this world was flawed and mishapped. And then you had others that believed that Yahweh was associated with Belial, or it was Baal that was associated with Belial, which was a fallen angel or leader of the fallen angels, which is still mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not all had that opinion. Some believed he was a complete separate figure, but these old traditions are all carrying on from this old ancient tradition of all these gods going to battle with each other, which is fascinating. So it's like the comic books of today of all the superheroes battling out. So you've got a good thing going on with your upcoming comics, Edward. So it's going to do the world some justice.
Let's hope they turn out well.
I mean, Ed, when you talked about the Baal cycle, way back, you had El, Baal, and Asherah. Who was that? Who was the?
No, there's a very clear pantheon there. You've got El and Asherah as the mother goddess and the high god. There's 3 goddesses: Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. And then you've got Baal, Yam, and Nar, just like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades.
Right.
That's
and
3
so
brothers.
El is the kind of like the patriarch there. So
he's
when
like
we call him
the Greek
Elohim, those other 2 are probably incorporated, and the other 2 are incorporated in him. So when in this story, it's like, who is Elohim? Baal? Choose you this day. Is it Baal or is it Yahweh? Which one is going to be God? It's kind of like, who's fighting for that?
Right.
Because as we saw, I mean, Asherah is there. Who's going to be the husband of Asherah? Is it Baal who's called husband, or is it Yahweh who is the patriarch here? I mean, is it what, are they fighting over the woman? I mean, there's some things there's some things here going on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's fighting to be king of the gods on the divine council. And that, but the king is the son of the father. There's still a high father above the king of the gods. So Zeus, Baal, Yahweh, they all play the same role. Whereas El, who's the old guy, he's the equivalent of Kronos in the Greek traditions. And Asherah is the equivalent of Rhea.
Yeah.
They're Titans. They're the older generation.
Right.
And so, but it's like Zeus and Poseidon fighting to be who's going to be king of the divine council, or or if Zeus had a rival and he had to like fight off another warrior storm god to like who's trying to like kick him out and take over the throne. But
Number
then
one
Yahweh
side.
does it one better by just collapsing the whole divine council, making the whole divine council go away.
Yahweh seems to me so much like Mars or Aries.
Like God of War style, I agree as well. But sometimes Ares was pretty nice, depending on what part you're looking at. Pretty sure Rome he was alright, but Greece not so much. They didn't like him in the Greek culture much. He was like one of the unliked gods, so he kind of had it kind of unfair. But Yahweh, I reckon, is a bit more violent. I reckon Ares would quench in his boots meeting Yahweh.
Yahweh seems like a pretty tough character here.
I wouldn't want to meet him.
Or
Especially
like a
the workers.
mashup between like Mars, Aries, and like Hades, Pluto. Like Yahweh's kind of like a mashup.
I think he probably maps more to Jupiter, and I think that the ancients probably did that too because of Yah Pater. I think that Yahweh was associated with
He was
Jupiter,
so was
being
El,
the son of El too.
Yeah, definitely Jupiter for sure.
Well, El was Saturn.
Yeah,
El is
sometimes
Saturn.
Jupiter
Yeah.
was also
But
linked
Jupiter
with
is Zeus
Saturn.
and Baal. They're all Baal because in the Roman times, Baal gets absorbed into Jupiter in the Roman era. And so,
There's
like
also
the temple at
that
Baalbek,
Jupiter overthrew
Oh,
that
really?
Lebanon becomes a temple to Jupiter. And the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, after the second temple is destroyed and becomes a Roman city, that also becomes a temple of Jupiter on the Temple Mount. No one ever talks about that too much. But for a few hundred years, it was first temple, second temple, a temple of Jupiter, and then the Muslims took it over and it became the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But they blew up a temple to Jupiter that was there on the Temple Mount
Wow.
for probably 400 years.
Yeah.
It's really the same quote gods, or as I like to think of it too, like it's the same archetypes that are showing up over and over again
Common
in
pattern,
all the
absolutely.
cultures, and they're fighting over what they're called and how to worship them, and people understandably identify themselves, or maybe like the part of themselves they wish they were in these archetypes, and that's part of the devotion. And they want this god to give them this thing that they don't themselves possess. And so yeah, okay, so that temple was devoted to however many gods over all of the years, and it's really probably just the same essential pattern with different words and different architecture as far as the ritualization and the prayer and the supplication and the sacrifice or the whatever.
Yeah,
Also,
the
Jupiter
Hindus say like
fighting
just
Saturn.
one god, countless names, and I totally think that since there's no authority, like you go, if you don't like the local priesthood, you go down the road, set up a new altar, change the name of the gods. I mean, you still keep the same basic cultural traditions, the same beliefs and understandings of the world and metaphysics and everything, but you just operate with a different name and a different set of priests, and you tweak it for your town sensibilities, for your community sensibilities. But people more or less are, believe in the same things. And then monotheism is truly revolutionary. But for a long time, it was just these nature-based traditions. And then there's two patterns. There's a Mesopotamian pattern, there's an Egyptian pattern. And then that later on, the Roman times get kind of blended. But this pattern we see here is coming from Mesopotamia. And I think the reason why these patterns persist is because they're imperial. And so when you get a king of the gods, goes hand in hand with having a king of men. And there's no king of the gods before there's kings of men. And so you have these various culture wars between various authorities that want, this priesthood wants to be in charge, not the other priesthood. So, and so, the gods fighting amongst themselves and the divine is being mirrored in a culture war on the ground between human beings fighting over very practical things of like who gets to be the boss, basically, who gets the money and the wealth and the big temple.
Also, astrology played a part in this too. Is why I mentioned about the Jupiter versing Saturn. If you guys are familiar with the Great Conjunction, where um, Jupiter orbits the Sun faster every 12 to 30 years, and thus you can actually see Jupiter basically overthrow Saturn in that sort of sense. And the ancients seen that as the gods fighting, and so I reckon some of this is also linked with those ancient pagan celebrations as well, doing with astrology. So I think that's also replicated in these texts, and they're saying that these gods are replacing another god. So Jupiter overthrowing Saturn, basically. And so one god overthrowing another one, becoming the head father god. And now it's being visible, and here's its kingdom here visible on Earth, basically. It's a vibe I get too.
I think that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, so the last big conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And it followed almost exactly a year after the grand conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which was the beginning of COVID.
Hmm.
That marked the beginning of COVID. And also, like, so the United States is in its Pluto return at this time. So the astrology is a reflection, I think, of these gods, but these archetypes and these energies that we all understand and recognize because they're universal patterns, you know. So, and Uranus, the planet Uranus, went into Gemini, and the US and Israel started a war with Iran. So, like, these things happen in very interesting ways with the synchronicities and the patterns.
No doubt.
Well, we're at an hour here. We can probably wrap it up, I think. Does anyone else have any more insightful comments? And we'll wrap it up.
Looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. It gets a little bloodier in the next
Yeah,
episode.
thanks.
And we'll get to see about how I mean, this is a pretty violent era. Like, the way you became king was to like go and kill the previous king and his entire family, and then you become king, and until somebody comes along and kills you and your whole family. Pretty tough time period of life. So anyway, that's what we'll talk about next week. A bunch of kings and queens all getting slaughtered. So anyway, thank you everybody, whoever's listening. lostgoddess.io, edwarddodge.substack.com. And we will see you next time. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Nathan.
Hi, thanks everybody. Good to see you all.